Welcome back to Wheel and Command Pro Tips. In this episode, I'm going to talk about CENTCOM Core's control head outputs. So in CENTCOM Core with WCX control heads, we have a lot more control over them than we did with WC control heads. So I'm going to grab a 21 and slide WCX and a knob WCX. And we're going to go forward. Now the first thing I want to point out is for WCX control heads, the slide switch is now treated as one input instead of 4 inputs. So in WC hardware, each one of these was an input that had an on-off state for slide switch control heads, but in CENTCOM Core, this is now just one input with multi-states, so you no longer have to worry about programming weirdness around that. The same holds true for the knob. The slide switch on this is one input, and the knob as well is one input. All right. So going back now, going into the outputs view in a 21 and slide control head tab, we now see that there are a lot more options here compared to in WeCan hardware. So once again, pulling this up, outputs, this is a Cantrol, 21 and slide. We only had the option of turning on our TA display, which was referencing these lights here, and we only had a set number of patterns that we could set them to play, and that was it. But in CENTCOM Core, we have a lot more control over what we're doing. So you see now at the bottom here, I have my traffic advisor 1 through 8 outputs, and this is referencing these outputs here. The nice thing is we can now flash these however we want in any way that we want. So we can of course play our TA left, right, and split patterns if we want to, but we can also do things like action flash, and we can have it alternate. Essentially treat these outputs as you would any other output on the outputs tab. You can program it however you want. Well, of course, the same holds true for the actual buttons here. So by default, we see that everything has an on instruction on it. And what this instruction is when I turn on this button, it's going to just turn on the button itself to just let me know that it's on. It's the normal red light that you would see when you push the button on. You do have the option of removing this instruction if you want. If you want to set up like a stealth button situation where it's not clear to someone else in the vehicle that this button is turned on or not. The real nice thing that comes in with this is for multi-state buttons, for example. I'm going to add 2 more presses to switch 9 here. We can set up different flash patterns for different states so you can easily tell what state you're in. So I'm going to set it where press 2 is going to be double flash, and my press 3 is going to be triple flash. And so now to the end user, it's very, very clear what press they're in. It's not just a steady on the entire time. When they're in press 2, it's going to blink 2 times at them. And when they're in press 3, it's going to be blinking 3 times at them. And press 1 is just going to be 1. You have the way of setting this up however you want now. You're in total control over your control head. So the next thing to cover is how you set up the backlights on here. So you see that we have this backlight column for everything except our slide switch and our TA outputs. This is because the traffic advisor outputs are outputs, so they don't really have a backlight, which is why you don't have the option of putting anything on them. And same thing for the slide switch lights. This is talking about the lights for the slide switch up here. So when I'm in slide 1, the light above slide 1 is on. When I'm in slide 2, the light above slide 2, slide 3. So that doesn't have a backlight either, so you can't do anything with that. But everything else, every other button on here does have a backlight. So we can just select everything and do enable backlight, and then we can set the backlight intensity if we desire. Next thing to cover is the indicator intensity. And so what that is referring to is when this button is on, how bright is it? So by default, you would just come in and set the indicator intensity like this, and that would cover it. But you also might have noticed that we have a low power column, and you might be wondering how that works. So how that works is if you have a flash pattern on a button, so on my switch 9 here, I've got a double flash, I can use low power to change how bright it is instead of indicator intensity. The general rule is if you have a flash pattern, use low power and use that intensity to adjust it. If you're using just a simple on, use the indicator intensity. The last thing to note is that the name column is going to reflect the name given to each input. So since we had some presets applied here, we see that the name matches what these buttons are called in the properties view. But if I go into switch 9 here and change its name to test, for example, and come into here, we'll see that the name now matches what I called it there. Anything that doesn't have a preset applied to it by default is just going to be called indicator switch and then whatever number it is. But you can go ahead and change this name either right here in the outputs tab or on the properties tab, and it's going to sync up and match. That about covers it for CENTCOM Core's Control Head Outputs tab. Thank you for watching, and please stay tuned for more Wheel and Command pro tips.